Good morning, brothers and sisters. This is Don Philip Veitch. Let us begin with the first Sunday after Trinity. O God, the strength of all those who put their trust in Thee, mercifully accept our prayers, because through the weakness of our mortal nature, we can do no good thing without Thee. Grant us the help of Thy grace, that in the keeping of Thy commandments we may please Thee, both in will and in deed. Well, we've been talking in this first section, in the prologue to the book, an opening chapter that gives us dispatches from the front, what it's really like out there. We got about 30 pages here in the prologue, and we pick up with Richard Young. They live in the same city, but otherwise Richard Young and Chuck McElhaney have little in common. We told the story about McElhaney being firebombed and persecuted by the LGBT community. One point of disagreement, ironically, would be the political significance of the domestic partners referendum. Both men believe that the bill was ultimately designed to give official recognition to gay and lesbian relationships. But while homosexuality is deeply and morally repugnant to one, it is natural and appropriate to the other. So, too, while official recognition of such a relationship represents a government's support of immorality to one, it implies a movement toward greater equality and justice for the other. Some people, Richmond says, want to think of gays as lonely, isolated, and unable to form stable relationships. One of the things I want people to understand is that gay people do form lasting relationships where they honor each other's feelings. The domestic partners law was just a mechanism to allow people to show that. He agrees on one level, then, with those that say the referendum is an effort by lesbians and gays to find acceptance as part of the family. This was not, he says, an effort to redefine the family in a proactive way, as Chuck believes. It was more of an effort to recognize and reflect in law the more inclusive and flexible way in which the family has actually evolved in our contemporary society. To this end, Richmond Young works in the precincts of San Francisco trying to get out the yes vote on Proposition S. In a city the size of San Francisco, it's not surprising that the two men do not know each other personally. Richmond does know Chuck by reputation, however, and his opinion is not all that flattering. Reverend McElhaney, he says, can't be characterized as anything else but an anti-gay bigot. He's not a homophobe. Homophobia is a word that's been used so often that people have forgotten what it means, which is an irrational fear of homosexuals and homosexuality. I wouldn't say that about McElhaney. Richmond readily admits that Chuck McElhaney's opposition to homosexuality stems not from a desire for power, which he says drives some of the opponents in the Bay Area, but rather a bigotry rooted in ignorance. He believes, too, probably incorrectly, that Chuck's hostility towards homosexuality would lose a lot of its force if he would understand what it means to be gay and what gays were like as people. It's interesting, he remarks, we think of this kind of bigotry and homophobia as something that takes place like in cities like Houston or Memphis or in the hinterlands of the country where people don't know any gays. But we have it only a few blocks away. Richmond Young is 38 years old and is an editor at a legal publishing firm. His roots in San Francisco are about as deep as any California can be. His family arrived in 1856 Some of his ancestral attachments to the city are fairly prominent. One grandfather was a Superior Court judge. The other was president of the San Francisco Bar Association. Richmond traces his political roots to the legacy of his maternal grandfather, the judge, who was an early 20th century progressive, a classic middle-aged class reformer, as Richmond describes him. His grandfather's legacy influenced the formation of his own political ideals that crystallized during his involvement in the anti-war protests of the 1960s. Again, this book is written in 1992. Even as a teenager, Richmond walked the precincts for Eugene McCarthy. He was in his mid-20s, however, that he became politically active on behalf of gay rights issues. He had known he was a homosexual since he was 19, but had repressed the inclination for 7 years. Then the Briggs Initiative, requiring the dismissal of homosexual teachers from public schools, was introduced into the state legislature. It was a time, Richmond says, to come out of the closet and to fight against discrimination. Adding to the complex portrait is the fact that Richard Young is an adult convert to Catholicism. He was 29 years old at the time. One night, he recounted, I had a sudden impression or realization of the reality of Jesus and of God. It came over me like a sudden realization. Richmond's, and I do think it was the same experience that other people describe as a conversion, second birth, being born again. Richmond Young's conversion gives him another ironic point of agreement with Chuck McElhaney. Richmond turned to Catholicism rather than Protestantism. However, my lover at the time was a devout Roman Catholic. Through him, Richmond met people whose Catholicism was an integral part of their lives, not just a sterile set of doctrines. He had philosophic and theological reasons for becoming a Catholic as well. One being that, as he puts it, Catholics don't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. Richmond, that's an interesting question. We don't know where modern Romanism is on that. I know there's liberalism that has gotten into the church and evolution and other things. Richmond's view of Catholicism as a universal church also led him to feel that Catholicism was more accepting of deviations or culture than Protestants. The church, he explained, has always been a part of the history of the world. It never sets itself apart. Its sins are also mankind's sins. Yet the Catholic Church does oppose homosexuality as resolutely as do evangelical churches like Chuck's. How then does Richmond reconcile his sexual orientation with his newfound faith? He argues that the church may be a vehicle of divine grace, but the church is not itself a divine institution. It is a human institution like any human institution. It makes mistakes. Richmond believes, therefore, that the traditional Catholic opposition to homosexuality results not from divine revelation, but from an unthinking accommodation to prevailing cultural opinions. As he puts it, on the matter of sexuality, the church reflects ancient prejudices designed to control people, to make them more dependent on the church rather than on the true teachings of Jesus. The teachings of the hierarchy on homosexuality then really don't apply. Homosexuality, he includes, is not a sin at all. Jesus, he reflects, wasn't interested in what people did in bed, but whether people dealt with others in a loving and compassionate way. In the end, Christ will judge us on the basis of our actions towards others. One sees a certain symmetry between Richmond's religious faith and his political ideals. Central to his religion is that the belief that Jesus came to offer liberation to anyone who would listen. But just insert here that we're not getting a very theological approach to Jesus, just Jesus in Richmond's own eyes. But in his view, the liberation Jesus brings is not a personal liberation from the sin of homosexuality, as Chuck would have it, but rather the liberation of individuals to live according to the dictates of personal conscience and style. This guy's bad news. He doesn't get it. In a serious way, he doesn't get it. I see Jesus recognizing everyone's radical equality. The ideals of liberation and equality that he sees embodied in the life of Jesus provide a theological foundation for his views of politics and national life. The same themes are pronounced. Quote, the essence of Americanism to me, he contends, is contained in the words of the Declaration of Independence, particularly in the lines, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, to me, expresses the essence of Americanism. It's what America is. We're not really much else except for that. I mean, everything else is sort of decoration. Our other accomplishments are not all that different from other countries, but our essential Americanism and what sets us apart are contained in those words. In the context of this political philosophy that Richmond sees both in his struggle as a politically conscious homosexual and the struggle of the larger gay and lesbian community, he puts it this way: rights always have an existence, but our perception of their existence and what kinds of rights people are seen to have are determined by our historical circumstances. He's a relativist. I believe that as we grow in understanding and knowledge, we develop a fuller understanding of the concept of rights. And as a consequence, the list of things that qualify rights expands. So he does theology by politics, exegesis by politics. Again, denying the Old Testament, misreading the New Testament, no systematic theology, no church history. He's out here talking in the practical arena and giving us an exhibit in cultural theology of a man who lives and thinks according to the dictates and desires of his own heart. That's the upshot. I think of gay people, Richmond goes on, as those who stand in line with many others and who are waiting to have their claim on that part of the Declaration recognized. We're just the latest to get in line for that. All of this quite naturally leads Richmond Young to a very different view of San Francisco than the one held by Chuck McElhaney, in sharp contrast to Chuck's view as a city of cesspool of moral decay. Richmond says, I like to think of San Francisco as the vanguard of fulfilling the Declaration of Independence. San Francisco has a reputation for tolerance and a history of enjoying and reveling in eccentricity. That's just part of the common experience and identity of the city. How then does he explain the tremendous political power of the Roman Catholic hierarchy and the evangelical churches, both in the Bay Area and the country as a whole? I'd like to think it is their last spasm before they go into final decline, he says, laughing. At least I hope it is. And there you have the conflict of the city of man and the city of God. He's wishing and hoping that the church goes away, either Roman or evangelical. We now switch to a dispatch, 7 May in New York. Hundreds of people are gathered in front of an abortion clinic in Midtown Manhattan to protest abortion. Many of the demonstrators were native New Yorkers, but they were joined by hundreds of others who'd come as far away from California, Texas, and North Carolina, a total of 35 states. What made today's rally unique was that the protests involved civil disobedience, a rescue, as the leaders of the demonstration put it. The location of the clinics to be picketed were kept secret right up until the time of protest in order to maximize the surprise and effect of the action. By sitting, standing, or marching in front of the clinic, the protesters created a human barricade, preventing anyone from going in or leaving. According to the spokesman, this was the protesters' objective. According to a spokesman, this is to prevent this clinic and every other one they visited from conducting abortions for one full day. Despite the protesters' prayers and hymns, the air was thick with tension. Pro-choice advocates who had learned of the demonstration argued and chanted, carried their own placards. Tempers flared on both sides until police arrived and carried away the protesters. 800 people were arrested, including 4 rabbis, several evangelical Protestant pastors, and half a dozen Roman Catholic leaders. Well, now we turn to this. That's the context. And now we turn to a fellow by the name of Yehuda Levin. One of the protesters arrested that day was Yehuda Levin, an orthodox Jewish rabbi from Brooklyn. It was the first time he had participated in a rescue. But as someone whose thinking on abortion had crystallized over the last several years, he felt it was time to express his opposition to a practice through this kind of action. Though he would become involved in other rescue activities later that summer in Atlanta, the events of May 7 remained fixed in his memory. The crowd, the police, the arguing and shouting, confusion, being carried onto a police bus with dozens of others and being booked at the local station. Maybe he remembered that particular day so well because he was pictured on the front page of Newsday the next day, holding a sign that read, "New York rabbis condemn abortion." As a Jew, Yehuda opposes abortion for reasons different from those of Catholics or evangelicals who participate in the rescues, yet his are no less binding. The ultimate reason he opposes abortion, Yehuda says, is that God opposes it. Thank you, Rabbi. We're on the same sheet of music here. By the way, I loved a few of the rabbis I worked with, 3 of them, now that I think about it, that I worked with closely. The Torah tells us that feticide is prohibited, he explains. It's not only prohibited, it's equated with a capital offense. That really is the beginning and the end of the subject. Rabbi, you spoke with clarity. At a more philosophic and theological level, and at the end, he argues that the very first commandment is to be fruitful and multiply. In this, God offers humankind partnership in creation, the act of producing children. When a person destroys the seed, Yehuda says, they are in effect rejecting this partnership. To destroy the seed is to abrogate the covenant, and that's one of the most serious infringements of our tradition there is. Thinking back, he says, he never could have imagined himself in this situation 10 years earlier as he was finishing rabbinic training. I had little knowledge of Roe v. Wade, he admits. No idea of how many abortions were being performed every year in America, and scant knowledge of what abortion was in the first place. It was beyond my purview. Indeed, Yehuda's whole world had been that of Orthodox Judaism, a community of other believers, the yearly traditions, and the daily observance, and the yeshiva. As he put it, I had very little contact with the Gentile world. I was living in a ghetto without walls. You see, it is inbred within our community that what goes on in the outside world is meshuggah, crazy. Just look at what the newspapers report or see what the billboards advertise. So if it is meshuggah, why should we bother at all? At age 24, however, Yehuda's awareness of the world outside his religious community began to grow. I began to learn up front, he says, that a war was being waged between those who were concerned with traditional morality and those who wanted to break down as many barriers as possible. This realization would be the beginning of a new chapter in Yehuda's life. Not long after his graduation from rabbinical school, he was invited to give the invocation at a March for Life rally in Washington, D.C., where he met the famous pro-life activist Nellie Gray and several members of Congress, and saw over 100,000 people show their support for the sanctity of human life. It gave me a tremendous jolt, he says, to see and encounter so many Gentiles with deep moral sensitivities that were akin to mine. They were fighting the meshuggah. This experience and few others like it made Yehuda realize, indeed, in his view, divine providence was leading him to see that the orthodox were not a dynamic force in this struggle, but should be. The latter belief spurred him to speak out publicly against the evil of abortion in America and about the general moral decline that had brought this to pass. It also prompted him to run for Congress against the Democratic incumbent Stephen Sollars. With no political experience and with no political organization, no experience, Yehuda not only obtained the Republican nomination, despite being a registered Democrat, but his count acquired 35% of the vote as the district's right-to-life candidate. It happened to be the district with the single highest concentration of Orthodox Jews in the country. A year later, Yehuda's conviction moved him to run for the mayor of New York City. He claims he had no illusions about winning, and indeed he gained more than 1% of the vote. His goal was not to win, but to distance traditional Jews from the liberal incumbent, who was to most people who seemed the quintessential Jew. I felt an obligation to demonstrate clearly that we did not countenance many of the things the mayor was doing. For Yehuda, abortion is merely one symbol of a larger pattern of moral decline in America. Obviously, he says, society is heading down a very dangerous road. The source of the problem is clear. We have got to be blind not to see a parallel between the decline of religion and religious values and all other things that are happening today. He insists he is not a crusader, that he's never set out to become involved this way, but that he came to see that he had a religious obligation, as he put it, to take the message of God's righteousness to the middle of the city, a reference to Lot and his family in the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. As for Chuck McElhaney, the scriptures of Yehuda's religious tradition not only shape his views on moral issues like abortion, but also compel him, perhaps even against his own personal inclinations, to take a public stand on behalf of what he believes to be God's created purposes for human society, including the protection of the unborn. His aggressive and even confrontational style of going to the middle of the city has made Yehuda not simply a curiosity, but a serious annoyance to many of his fellow New Yorkers. His personal abrasiveness, some have said, is legendary. He tells, for example, of the time he and a number of other clergies marched into the office of the chair of the Board of Education to demand a meeting in response to a newly initiated sex education curriculum that they considered totally devoid of values. Even Yehuda admits that his methods have been excessive from time to time, but he considers his actions to be consistent with his passionate stand on issues of value and morality. The host of a local television show once observed that it seemed rather inappropriate, even undignified, for a man of the cloth to do the things that he did. What is it to me, Yehuda came back sharply, if I lose some of my dignity? You tell me, what does it take you to get upset? Do you have to rape your wife and daughter in Central Park? Is that when you start screaming? This is probably a good place for us to stop as we attempt in our work, theological work, to not exclude cultural contemporary issues, calling it cultural theology as part of the hermeneutic. Old, new, systematic church history, practical theology, and contemporary theology. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God, the nation is awash in immorality and murder, sexual sins, greed, violation of the Sabbath, massive disrespect as we see on our streets, and the manifold wickednesses of abortion. Oh Lord, well, you'll do with us as you will, but we plead for your mercy, that we might continue to have lives of freedom and peace here in this country. And if not, oh God, spare your elect, we beseech thee. In the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Until next time, Godspeed.